On a crisp October morning in 1998, the last autumn mist clung to the ancient pines of Mount Thornfield, like ghostly fingers reluctant to release their hold on the living world. The mountain stood sentinel over the small Washington town of Cedar Falls, its granite peaks piercing a sky the color of old pewter. From the valley below, hikers' voices carried on the thin air, young, eager, full of that particular brand of invincibility that belongs only to those who have never truly faced the mountain's darker moods. Derek Chen adjusted the straps of his burgundy backpack, his breath forming small clouds in the 40-degree air. At 24, he possessed the lean build of someone who spent weekends conquering trails rather than conquering video games, though his software engineering job at a startup in Seattle had given him the pallor of too many late nights debugging code. His dark eyes swept across the trailhead information board, reading warnings about bear activity and weather conditions with the casual dismissiveness of someone who had hiked these paths a dozen times before. "You're overthinking it again," Amanda Rodriguez called from beside their rented Ford Explorer, her voice carrying that musical laugh that had first caught his attention 2 years ago at a mutual friend's party. She stood silhouetted against the vehicle's red paint, her honey-colored hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, revealing the constellation of freckles across her nose that Derek had memorized during countless Sunday morning conversations over coffee and crossword puzzles. At 22, Amanda carried herself with the confidence of someone who had grown up exploring the wilderness of her native Colorado before following her journalism degree to the Pacific Northwest. "I'm not overthinking," Derek protested, shouldering his pack with the methodical precision that had made him an excellent programmer, and Amanda often teased, an occasionally insufferable hiking partner. "I'm being prepared. There's a difference." The parking area at Thornfield's eastern approach held only 3 other vehicles that morning: a dented pickup truck belonging to the ranger station, a pristine SUV that screamed weekend warrior, and an aging Subaru wagon covered in environmental bumper stickers. The usual early-season crowd had thinned with the approach of November, leaving the mountain to the dedicated few who understood that autumn hiking offered rewards unavailable to fair-weather adventurers. Amanda consulted the trail map they had studied over breakfast at Maggie's diner in town, her finger tracing the red line that marked their intended route. The Cascade Loop promised 12 miles of moderate terrain, winding through old-growth forest before emerging onto exposed ridges that offered panoramic views of the Cascade Range. Weather reports predicted clear skies and temperatures climbing into the low 60s by afternoon, perfect conditions for what Derek had secretly planned as more than just another weekend hike. The engagement ring nestled in the bottom of his pack represented 2 months of careful saving and 3 weeks of agonizing over the perfect setting. Mount Thornfield held special significance for their relationship. It was here, on a similar October day 18 months ago, that they had shared their first "I love you" while watching the sunrise paint the distant peaks in shades of rose and gold. Derek had imagined proposing at Overlook Point, the trail's scenic climax, with the entire Cascade wilderness stretched out before them like a promise of their future together. "Ready?" Amanda asked, clipping her water bottle to her belt with practiced efficiency. She wore layers suitable for the mountain's notorious mood swings: moisture-wicking base layer, fleece mid-layer, and a shell jacket tied around her waist. Her hiking boots, broken in through months of weekend adventures, showed the comfortable wear of someone who took the outdoors seriously. Derek performed his final gear check with ritualistic thoroughness: headlamp, first aid kit, emergency whistle, topographic map sealed in a waterproof case, extra batteries, energy bars, and the small blue velvet box that made his heart race every time his fingers brushed against it. Amanda watched this routine with fond amusement, having learned that Derek's need for preparation was less about anxiety and more about the deep care he felt for their safety and success. They set off up the Cascade Loop Trail at 8:47 a.m. According to Derek's GPS watch, a recent graduation gift from Amanda that he had initially dismissed as unnecessary technology but had quickly grown to love. The trail began gently, meandering through a cathedral of Douglas fir and western hemlock, their trunks disappearing into the low-hanging mist like pillars supporting a vast green ceiling. Somewhere in the distance, a stellar's jay called its harsh cry, answered by the rapid drumming of a pileated woodpecker working a snag. For the first hour, they maintained the comfortable rhythm they had developed over dozens of shared hikes. Amanda setting a slightly faster pace on the flats and downhills, Derek taking the lead on technical climbs where his longer stride proved advantageous. They talked easily about work, friends, plans for Thanksgiving with Derek's family in Portland, the new apartment they were considering closer to downtown Seattle. Normal conversation between two people building a life together, unaware that these would be among the last words anyone would hear them speak. The mist burned off as they climbed, revealing a day of startling clarity. By mile 3, they had gained enough elevation to look back toward Cedar Falls. The town spread across the valley floor like a collection of toys, the Columbia River glinting silver in the distance. Amanda paused at a switchback to capture the view with her Canon camera, the motor drive whirring as she bracketed exposures with the methodical approach of someone who understood that perfect light was a fleeting gift. "We should frame this one," she said, showing Derek the composition through the viewfinder. The town below looked impossibly peaceful, smoke rising from chimneys in perfectly straight lines in the still air. For the new apartment. Derek nodded, though his attention had shifted to studying the terrain ahead. The trail would soon emerge from the forest onto more exposed ground, where weather could change rapidly and navigation became more critical. He consulted his map again, noting the marked creek crossings and the side trail that led to Overlook Point, still hours ahead. At the 4-mile mark, they stopped for lunch at Widow's Creek, a small stream that cascaded down smooth granite slabs in a series of miniature waterfalls. Amanda found a sun-warmed boulder beside the water and unpacked their sandwiches while Derek filled their water bottles, adding purification tablets with the same methodical care he brought to all outdoor tasks. The creek's music provided a peaceful soundtrack as they ate turkey and Swiss on whole-grain bread, sharing an apple and discussing the afternoon's route. "The weather's holding beautifully," Amanda observed, tilting her face toward the sun. "I was worried about those clouds they showed on the morning forecast." Derek glanced at the sky, noting the high cirrus clouds that had appeared over the past hour, wispy mare's tails that often presaged changing weather, but posed no immediate threat. His weather radio, checked that morning, had confirmed favorable conditions through late afternoon. Still, mountain weather demanded respect, and he made a mental note to monitor the sky as they gained elevation. They resumed hiking at 12:15 p.m., entering terrain where the forest began to thin and granite outcroppings became more frequent. Here, the trail demanded greater attention as it wound between house-sized boulders and across exposed slabs where paint blazes marked the route. Amanda's photography training proved valuable in reading the subtle variations in rock color and texture that indicated the correct path when the trail became unclear. At 1:30 p.m. they reached the junction with the Overlook Point Spur Trail, marked by a weathered wooden sign that directed hikers up a steep quarter-mile climb to the scenic destination. Derek felt his pulse quicken, not from the elevation but from the weight of the ring in his pack and the magnitude of what he planned to do at the trail's end. Amanda, unaware of his nervousness, studied the sign with the same careful attention she gave all trail markers. "Still want to hit the overlook?" she asked. "We're making good time, but those clouds are building." Derek followed her gaze to the western horizon, where the innocent morning cirrus had thickened into more substantial formations. Not immediately threatening, but a reminder that October weather in the Cascades could shift from benign to dangerous with little warning. The afternoon was still young, though, and Overlook Point beckoned with its promise of spectacular views and the perfect setting for a moment that would change their lives forever. "Let's do it," he said, trying to keep his voice casual despite the hammering of his heart. "We've come this far." They turned up the spur trail, climbing through increasingly sparse vegetation toward the rocky prominence that crowned this section of the ridge. The path grew steeper and more demanding, requiring occasional use of handholds where the route crossed near vertical granite slab. Amanda moved with the fluid grace of an experienced climber, her camera bouncing gently against her hip as she navigated the exposed terrain. The overlook revealed itself gradually, the trees falling away to expose an amphitheater of granite that commanded views across the entire Cascade wilderness. Mount Rainier dominated the southern horizon, its glaciated bulk rising like a white pyramid above layers of blue ridges. To the north, the jagged peaks of the North Cascade scratched at the sky, while westward, the terrain rolled away in endless waves toward the distant Pacific. Amanda stood at the overlook's edge, her arms spread wide as if to embrace the vast landscape. "This is why we do this," she said, her voice carrying a note of reverence that Derek recognized as her deepest appreciation for wild places. "This is what makes everything else worthwhile." Derek set down his pack with hands that trembled slightly, reaching for the small blue box that had occupied his thoughts for weeks. This was the moment he had planned and replanned, the perfect setting for the question that would define their future. Amanda remained focused on the view, unaware of the drama about to unfold behind her. But as Derek's fingers closed around the ring box, Amanda suddenly tensed, her posture shifting from relaxation to alertness. "Derek," she said quietly, her voice carrying a new note of concern, "do you hear that?" He froze, listening intently to the mountain's soundscape. Wind sighed through the sparse trees below, and somewhere in the distance, a raven called from the depths of the valley. But underneath these natural sounds, almost at the edge of perception, came something else, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to pulse up from the depths of the mountain itself. "What is it?" Derek asked, the ring box forgotten as he joined Amanda at the overlook's edge. She pointed toward a section of the valley where the forest appeared denser and darker than the surrounding terrain. "It's coming from down there, like machinery, but that can't be right. This is designated wilderness." The sound grew marginally louder, confirming Amanda's assessment. It had an industrial quality that seemed profoundly out of place in the pristine wilderness, a steady thrumming that suggested large machinery operating somewhere below the forest canopy. Derek consulted his topographic map, trying to identify potential sources for such a sound, but the area Amanda had indicated showed nothing but unbroken wilderness. "Maybe it's a helicopter," he suggested, though even as he spoke, he recognized that the sound lacked the distinctive chop of rotor blades. This was something else entirely, deeper, more sustained, with an almost mechanical rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the granite beneath their feet. Amanda adjusted her camera's telephoto lens, scanning the valley floor for any sign of activity. The dense forest revealed nothing, its canopy unbroken by clearings or structures that might explain the mysterious sound. Yet the thrumming continued, growing neither louder nor softer, but maintaining its steady pulse like a massive heartbeat hidden within the mountain. "We should check it out," Amanda said, lowering her camera with the decisive movement Derek recognized as her journalist instincts kicking in. If someone's operating machinery in a wilderness area, that's a story worth investigating. Derek felt a stab of disappointment at the thought of abandoning his carefully planned proposal, but Amanda's curiosity was one of the qualities he loved most about her. The ring could wait. Their shared sense of adventure and discovery was what had brought them together in the first place. "How do we get down there?" he asked, studying the terrain between their position and the sound's apparent source. The forest below looked impenetrable, with no obvious trails or access routes visible from their elevated vantage point. Amanda traced potential routes with her finger, using her topographic knowledge to identify the most feasible approach. "There," she said, pointing to a fold in the ridgeline about half a mile north of their position. "It looks like there might be a drainage that leads down into that area, if we can find a way to connect with it." Derek checked his watch, 2:45 p.m. They had planned to be starting their return hike by 3 a.m., giving themselves plenty of daylight for the descent to the trailhead. Investigating the mysterious sound would add hours to their day and potentially put them on unfamiliar terrain as darkness approached. Every piece of his outdoor training argued against such a deviation from their planned route. But Amanda was already shouldering her pack, her face alive with the excitement of discovery. The mechanical thrumming continued to pulse from the valley below, a riddle that demanded solving. Against his better judgment, Derek found himself caught up in her enthusiasm, the practical voice in his head drowned out by curiosity and the desire to share whatever adventure awaited them in the mysterious valley. They left Overlook Point at 3:10 p.m. Following a faint game trail that descended along the ridgeline toward the drainage Amanda had identified. The afternoon had grown noticeably cooler, and the clouds that had been building all day now covered more than half the sky. Still well within the bounds of reasonable weather, but Derek made a mental note to monitor conditions carefully as they descended into unfamiliar terrain. The game trail proved more substantial than expected, winding down through sparse timber and across granite slabs with the efficient routing that suggested regular use by deer and elk. Amanda led the way, her photographer's eye helping her read the subtle signs that marked the safest passage across increasingly steep terrain. Behind her, Derek fought a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the physical challenges of their route. Something about the sound troubled him, not just its presence in a supposed wilderness area, but its quality. The more he listened, the more convinced he became that this was no ordinary machinery. The rhythm was too organic, too much like breathing or a heartbeat. It seemed to resonate not just through the air, but through the granite itself, as if the mountain were somehow alive, and they were descending toward its vital organs. By 4:00 p.m., they had dropped nearly 1,000 feet from the overlook, entering a different world entirely. The forest here was older and darker, dominated by massive cedar and fir trees that blocked most of the afternoon light. Moss hung in heavy curtains from the branches, and the air carried the rich, loamy scent of ancient decay. The mysterious sound had grown noticeably louder, though its source remained hidden somewhere ahead in the green twilight. Amanda stopped at a small clearing, where a seasonal stream cut across their path. "Listen," she whispered, though Derek couldn't understand why she felt the need for quiet. The thrumming was now loud enough to feel as much as hear, a deep vibration that seemed to emanate from the earth beneath their feet. "It's coming from just ahead," Derek said, consulting his GPS to mark their position. They had traveled nearly 2 miles from the main trail, following deer paths and dry creek beds deeper into terrain that showed no signs of human passage. Whatever was generating the sound lay hidden in a section of forest that appeared untouched since the last ice age. They resumed their descent, moving more cautiously now as the sound grew stronger and the forest grew darker. Ancient trees rose like cathedral pillars around them, their trunks so massive that Derek and Amanda together couldn't have encircled them with outstretched arms. Somewhere in the canopy above, ravens called to each other with harsh cries that seemed to echo the rhythm of the mysterious thrumming. At 4:30 p.m., the trees suddenly opened into a clearing, unlike anything either of them had ever seen. It was perfectly circular, perhaps 50 yards across, carpeted with grass, so green it seemed to glow in the filtered light. At the clearing's center stood a ring of standing stones, not large like Stonehenge, but human-sized monoliths of black granite that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the afternoon light. And carved into each stone, in letters deep enough to catch shadows, were names and dates. Derek approached the nearest stone with mounting disbelief, reading inscriptions that dated back decades. Margaret and James Fletcher, 1967. Patricia Nolan, 1973. Robert and Catherine Mills. The names continued around the circle, chronicling a parade of people who had apparently reached this hidden clearing over the past 30 years. Amanda circled the stones in the opposite direction, her camera clicking rapidly as she documented the impossible discovery. "Derek," she called, her voice tight with excitement and growing alarm. "Some of these are recent. Look at this one. Jennifer and Michael Park. That's only 2 years ago." The mechanical thrumming had grown so loud now that conversation required raised voices, though its source remained mysteriously invisible. Derek completed his circuit of the stone circle, counting 43 stones in total, each bearing one or more names with dates spanning from night. The carving quality was uniformly excellent, far too professional for casual graffiti, with letters cut deep into the granite and filled with what appeared to be silver inlay. "This doesn't make sense," Amanda said, lowering her camera as she tried to process what they had discovered. "Why would someone build a memorial in the middle of nowhere? And how did they get these stones here? Some of them must weigh tons." Derek examined the nearest stone more closely, running his fingers over the carved letters. The granite was cold to the touch despite the afternoon warmth, and he could feel the vibration of the mysterious sound traveling through the stone itself. The name Robert and Catherine Mills had been carved with remarkable precision, the letters perfectly spaced and aligned. Below the names, smaller text indicated "Lost to the Mountain, September." Their memorials, he realized, stepping back from the stone with a growing sense of dread. All of these people, they're not visitors who signed their names. They're people who died out here. Amanda joined him beside the Mills stone, reading the inscription with mounting horror. But how is that possible? I mean, 43 people over 40 years. We would have heard about that many hiking fatalities. It would be national news. Derek was already pulling out his cell phone, hoping against hope for a signal that might allow them to call for help or at least verify what they had discovered. The small LCD screen showed no bars, not surprising given their location deep in the mountain's radio shadow. But the act of checking gave him something to do while his mind raced to process the implications of their discovery. The thrumming sound suddenly stopped. "We need to leave," Amanda said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Right now." Derek nodded, shouldering his pack with movements made clumsy by sudden fear. The clearing that had seemed mysterious and intriguing moments before now felt threatening, as if the circle of stones were watching them with malevolent attention. The afternoon light filtering through the canopy seemed dimmer than it should be, though Derek's watch showed only 4. They moved toward the edge of the clearing at a pace just short of running, Amanda leading the way back toward the faint trail they had followed down from the ridge. Behind them, the stone circle stood in perfect silence, its dark monuments bearing witness to decades of loss in a place that officially didn't exist. But as they reached the trail line, Amanda suddenly stopped, her hand raised in a gesture that froze Derek in his tracks. She was staring at something ahead of them, her face pale with shock and growing terror. "Derek," she whispered, "look at the tree." He followed her gaze to a massive cedar just at the edge of the clearing, its trunk scarred by what appeared to be fresh carving. Letters had been cut deep into the bark, still bleeding sap that gleamed like amber in the fading light. The inscription was new, so new that wood chips still littered the ground at the tree's base. "Derek Chen and Amanda Rodriguez," the carving read, followed by that day's date, October 5th. The mechanical thrumming resumed, louder than before and closer, as if it were rising from the earth directly beneath their feet. The carved letters seemed to pulse with malevolent life in the dying afternoon light. Each character cut so deep into the cedar's flesh that Derek could have inserted his finger into the grooves. Fresh wood shavings carpeted the forest floor around the tree's base, their pale yellow color stark against the dark earth, while amber sap continued to weep from the wounds like tears from an ancient giant. Amanda raised her camera with trembling hands, the motor drive's mechanical whir seeming obscenely loud in the supernatural quiet that had fallen over the clearing. Through the viewfinder, the carved names appeared even more ominous, the shadows within each letter creating the illusion of depth that extended far beyond the physical dimensions of the cuts. "This is impossible," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible above the renewed thrumming that now seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath their feet. "No one knew we were coming here. Hell, we didn't even know we were coming here until an hour ago." Amanda lowered her camera, her face pale but determined. "We document everything," she said, falling back on her journalistic training like a lifeline in a storm. "Pictures, GPS coordinates, measurements. Whatever's happening here, we're going to make sure the world knows about it." But even as she spoke, Derek noticed something that made his blood run cold. The carving in the tree was changing, not dramatically. The alteration was so subtle that he might have missed it if fear hadn't sharpened his attention to laser focus. But the letters were definitely growing deeper. As he watched, transfixed with horror, the groove forming the D in Derek extended another millimeter into the cedar's heartwood. "Amanda," he said, grabbing her arm with enough force to make her gasp. "The carving, it's still happening." The thrumming grew louder, more insistent, and Derek realized with dawning terror that it was coming from multiple directions now, not just from the stone circle behind them, but from the forest ahead, from the slopes above, from every direction except the narrow game trail that had brought them to this cursed place. "We run," Amanda said, her voice steady despite the fear written across her features. "Right now, we follow our trail back to the main path, and we don't stop until we reach the parking lot." Derek nodded, shouldering his pack with movements made clumsy by adrenaline. The engagement ring in the bottom compartment, forgotten symbol of a future that suddenly seemed impossibly distant, bounced against his hip as they turned away from the self-carving tree and plunged into the darkening forest. The game trail that had seemed so clear during their descent now appeared to shift and blur before their eyes. Paths that Derek was certain they had followed branched in directions he didn't remember, while familiar landmarks seemed to rearrange themselves when he wasn't looking directly at them. Amanda led the way, consulting her GPS unit every few hundred yards, but the small screen showed only error messages where their coordinates should have been. "The satellite signal's blocked," she reported, shaking the device as if that might restore its function. Either by the canopy or... She didn't finish the sentence, but Derek understood. Whatever force could carve names into trees before their owners arrived might easily interfere with GPS satellites. They climbed steadily through the ancient forest, retracing their route by memory and the fading traces of their own passage. The thrumming followed them, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always present like a mechanical heartbeat that had synchronized itself with their rising panic. Occasionally, Derek caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, shadows that flitted between the massive tree trunks just beyond the range of clear sight. At 5:30 p.m., they should have reached the seasonal stream where Amanda had whispered for silence during their descent. Instead, they found themselves in a section of forest, neither recognized, surrounded by trees that seemed somehow different from those they had passed earlier. The bark was darker, the moss heavier, and the very air felt thicker, as if they were breathing the exhalations of something vast and ancient. "This isn't right," Amanda said, consulting her compass with growing frustration. "We've been climbing northeast for 40 minutes. We should have intersected the main trail by now." Derek checked his watch, noting that the digital display flickered occasionally, showing impossible times, sometimes hours in the future, sometimes dates that hadn't occurred yet. The LCD seemed to struggle against some form of interference, fighting to maintain its connection to the satellite network that determined global time. The forest around them grew darker as evening approached, though Derek's malfunctioning watch made it impossible to determine the actual time. The canopy above blocked most of the sky, creating a tunnel of green twilight that seemed to extend infinitely in all directions. Somewhere in the darkness overhead, ravens called to each other with harsh cries that echoed the rhythm of the omnipresent thrumming. "There," Amanda said suddenly, pointing toward a break in the trees ahead. "I can see sky." They emerged into another clearing, smaller than the stone circle, but no less unsettling. This space was natural, created by some long-ago avalanche that had cleared the forest in a rough triangle pointing downslope toward the valley. But scattered across the clearing's floor were objects that had no business existing in pristine wilderness. A child's bicycle, its red paint still bright, despite obvious exposure to weather. A woman's high-heeled shoe, expensive-looking and barely worn. A briefcase, its leather cracked but intact, with brass corners that caught the fading light. Dozens of personal items lay scattered across the grass like artifacts from lives interrupted, belongings that told stories of people who had walked into this forest and never walked out. Derek approached the briefcase with mounting dread, noting the initials RM embossed in gold letters on the handle. Inside, protected by the leather case's waterproof seal, he found business cards, a day planner, and a driver's license belonging to Robert Mills, one of the names they had seen carved into the memorial stones. September 15, 1981, Derek read from the license's expiration date. He would have been hiking just before this expired. Amanda was documenting the scattered belongings with systematic precision, photographing each item from multiple angles while maintaining a running inventory in her notebook. Her journalist training served as armor against the growing horror of what they were discovering, though Derek could see the strain in the tight lines around her eyes. "These aren't random," she observed, studying the pattern of scattered objects. "They're arranged. Look at how they're positioned. It's almost like they're pointing." Derek followed her analysis, noting that the larger items, the bicycle, a hiking pack, what appeared to be a tent still in its stuff sack, formed a rough arrow pointing toward the forest's edge on the clearing's far side. The arrangement was subtle but unmistakable once Amanda had pointed it out, as if someone had carefully positioned the belongings to guide visitors in a specific direction. The thrumming grew louder as they approached the forest edge, joined now by new sounds that made Derek's skin crawl. Whispers seemed to emanate from between the trees, not quite human voices, but something that suggested language without words. The acoustic effect was so realistic that Derek found himself turning toward the sounds, expecting to see speakers hidden among the branches. "Do you hear that?" Amanda asked, lowering her camera as she strained to identify the source of the whispers. "Voices," Derek confirmed, though even as he spoke he realized the sounds weren't quite right. They had the cadence of human speech, but lacked the resonance of actual vocal cords. It was as if the forest itself were trying to mimic conversation without truly understanding what made speech human. They entered the trees following the path indicated by the arranged belongings, moving deeper into forest that grew progressively stranger with each step. The whispers grew more distinct, occasionally resolving into what sounded like fragments of actual words. "This way, come closer, join us." Derek's rational mind rejected the possibility of disembodied voices, but his senses insisted otherwise. The sounds had direction and substance, seeming to come from specific locations among the trees. Occasionally he caught glimpses of pale shapes moving between the trunks, figures that looked almost human until his eyes focused directly on them. At 6:15 p.m., according to Derek's increasingly unreliable watch, they stumbled into a third clearing that defied all logic and natural law. This space was perfectly circular, perhaps 30 feet across, but its most unsettling feature was the complete absence of plant life. The ground was bare earth, packed hard and smooth as if thousands of feet had walked the same circular path for decades. At the clearing's center stood a single object that made Amanda gasp and raise her camera reflexively. A tree, but not like any tree that belonged in a Pacific Northwest forest. This specimen was ancient beyond measure, its trunk twisted into impossible spirals that hurt to look at directly. Its bark was pale, almost white, and completely smooth except for deep carvings that covered every visible surface. Names and dates spiraled up the trunk in tight helixes, hundreds of inscriptions that chronicled decades of human presence in this supposedly wild place. "My God," Amanda whispered, approaching the tree with the reverent caution of someone entering a cathedral. "It's all of them, everyone who's ever disappeared up here." Derek circled the tree, reading names that spanned nearly a century. The earliest carved date was 1903, the letters worn smooth by time but still legible in the pale bark. The most recent inscription was dated just 3 days earlier, Marcus Webb, October 12, 1998. The letters still sharp and fresh. "This can't be natural," Derek said, running his fingers over the spiraling carvings. The bark felt warm despite the cooling evening air, and he could feel vibrations traveling through the wood. the same thrumming that had been following them since they first discovered the stone circle. Amanda was photographing the trees systematically, documenting every visible name and date with the methodical approach of someone who understood they might be the only witnesses to an impossible truth. Her camera's flash illuminated the twisted bark in stark detail, revealing carving techniques that varied by era but maintained consistent letter spacing and depth. The mountains keeping track, she realized, lowering her camera as the full implications of their discovery hit her. All these people, they didn't just die up here. They were collected, catalogued. The whispers that had been following them through the forest grew louder, more insistent, and Derek realized they were no longer suggestions or fragments of words. Now the voices carried clear intent. Join us. Stay. Become part of the mountain. Derek grabbed Amanda's hand, feeling the warmth of her skin as an anchor to the world of the living. We have to get out of here. Now. Before dark. But even as he spoke, Derek realized that darkness was falling with unnatural speed. The sky above the clearing had turned deep purple despite his watch showing 6:30 p.m. at least 3 hours before sunset should occur in mid-October. Stars were becoming visible overhead, not the familiar constellations of autumn in the Pacific Northwest, but patterns that seemed to shift and rearrange themselves when he looked directly at them. Amanda shouldered her camera bag with movements sharp with determination. The trail, she said, pointing toward what appeared to be a well-worn path leading out of the clearing's far side. It's our only chance. They followed the path into forest that had become completely alien. The trees here were wrong, too tall, too straight, with bark that gleamed silver in the starlight that shouldn't exist. The undergrowth had disappeared entirely, leaving a park-like landscape that felt more like a stage set than natural wilderness. Even the air tasted different, carrying metallic notes that reminded Derek of ozone and copper. The thrumming was louder now, almost overwhelming, and Derek realized it was synchronized with his heartbeat, not mimicking the rhythm, but somehow controlling it, drawing his cardiovascular system into harmony with whatever massive mechanism lay hidden beneath the mountain. His pulse quickened, and the mechanical sound quickened with it, creating a feedback loop that threatened to overwhelm his nervous system entirely. Derek, Amanda gasped, stumbling against him as her own body fell victim to the same synchronization. Can't breathe properly. They supported each other as they struggled along the path, fighting against the mounting physiological pressure that seemed designed to drag them down into harmony with the mountain's alien rhythms. Derek's vision began to tunnel, peripheral darkness closing in as his body forgot how to maintain its own natural cadence. But just as unconsciousness threatened to claim them both, the path curved sharply to the right and deposited them onto familiar ground. The main Cascade loop trail, exactly where they had left it hours earlier when they first heard the mysterious sound. The thrumming stopped instantly, leaving them gasping in the sudden silence. Derek's watch resumed normal function, showing 7:45 p.m. late, but not impossibly so, given their extended off-trail adventure. The stars overhead resolved into recognizable autumn constellations, and the air once again carried the clean scent of Douglas fir and mountain water. What the hell just happened to us? Amanda asked, checking her camera to ensure their photographic evidence had survived whatever reality distortion they had experienced. Derek consulted his GPS, which now showed clear satellite reception and their correct location on the main trail. According to the device's track log, they had never left the official trail system. The electronic record showed a normal hiking day with no detours or unexplained gaps, as if their journey into the mountain's heart had occurred in some parallel dimension that left no digital trace. They descended toward the trailhead in the gathering darkness, using headlamps to navigate the familiar switchbacks. Neither spoke much, both struggling to process what they had experienced and wondering if anyone would believe their story. Amanda's camera contained dozens of photographs, but would the images prove anything, or would they be dismissed as elaborate hoaxes? The parking lot appeared ahead of them at 9:30 p.m., their Ford Explorer waiting exactly where they had left it 12 hours earlier. But as they approached the vehicle, Derek noticed something that made his blood run cold once again. A piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper, a note that hadn't been there when they started their hike. Amanda pulled it free with trembling fingers, unfolding what appeared to be a missing persons flyer printed on standard copy paper. The photographs showed Derek and Amanda themselves, the same images that appeared on their driver's licenses. Bold text across the top read, "Missing hikers," followed by their names, ages, and a description of their planned route. At the bottom, in smaller print, was a date that made Amanda's knees buckle. Last seen October 15, 1998. Search suspended after 2 weeks. Memorial service planned for November. Derek snatched the flyer from her hands, reading the impossible text by the light of his headlamp. The paper was real, cheap copy paper with the slightly fuzzy text quality of an old photocopier. The photographs were definitely their own driver's license images, somehow reproduced despite being secured in Derek's wallet. "This is someone's idea of a sick joke," Derek said, but his voice lacked conviction. The flyer felt authentic, complete with the bureaucratic language and official formatting of actual missing persons notices. Amanda was examining her camera's LCD display, scrolling through the dozens of photographs she had taken throughout their surreal afternoon. But as Derek watched over her shoulder, the images began to change. The memorial stones flickered and disappeared from the frames, leaving only empty forest. The twisted tree with its spiral of carved names dissolved into normal Douglas fir. Even the scattered belongings in the second clearing vanished, replaced by innocuous woodland scenes. "No," Amanda whispered, frantically pressing buttons to try to restore the original images. "They were here. I photographed everything." But the camera's memory now contained only normal hiking photos, scenic views, wildlife shots, and a few pictures of Derek looking nervous near what appeared to be a standard forest overlook. Even the timestamps had changed, creating a perfectly normal record of an ordinary hiking day. Derek's cell phone buzzed with an incoming text message, the first signal they had received since morning. The number was unknown, but the message was brief and chilling. "Welcome home. Your memorial stone is ready." As they stood in the empty parking lot, staring at evidence that contradicted their lived experience, Derek noticed that the other vehicles he had observed that morning were gone. Only their Explorer remained, isolated under the harsh glow of a single security light that cast harsh shadows across the gravel. The forest around them was completely silent. No wind, no night birds, no insects. Even the distant sound of the highway that should have been audible from the trailhead was absent, leaving them in a bubble of absolute quiet that felt more like a tomb than a living wilderness. Amanda tried to start the engine, but the Ford refused to turn over. The battery was fully charged according to the dashboard indicators, but the starter wouldn't engage. Derek checked under the hood by flashlight, finding everything apparently normal, yet somehow wrong in ways he couldn't articulate. It was then that Derek noticed the trail register by the information board, a simple logbook where hikers signed in and out to help rangers track wilderness use. He approached it with growing dread, knowing what he would find but hoping desperately to be wrong. The most recent entry was in his own handwriting. Derek Chen and Amanda Rodriguez, Party of Truthel, Cascade Loop Trail. Expected return 6 p.m. The date was correct, but below their entry, in different handwriting, someone had added a single word over. Below that, in the same official script found on the memorial stones, was a final entry, "Search terminated." Added to memorial, October. The date was 2 weeks in the future. As Derek stared at the impossible entry, headlights appeared on the access road leading to the trailhead. A single vehicle approached slowly, its high beams creating harsh shadows that seemed to move independently of the light source. The car was old, a 1970s sedan with the boxy lines of an earlier era, but it moved with perfect mechanical precision despite its apparent age. The vehicle stopped at the parking lot's edge, engine running with a smooth idle that somehow managed to sound menacing. Through the windshield, Derek could see a single occupant, but the figure remained motionless and indistinct despite the interior dome light that should have illuminated the driver clearly. Amanda gripped Derek's arm with fingers that dug into his flesh through his jacket. "We need to hide," she whispered, though the empty parking lot offered no concealment. The sedan's door opened with the metallic creak of old hinges, and a figure emerged that made Derek's sanity question itself. The driver appeared to be a man in his 50s, wearing a park ranger uniform that looked authentic in every detail except for its apparent age. The fabric was worn and faded, and the metal badge on his chest was tarnished with decades of exposure. But it was the ranger's face that truly terrified Derek. The features were human, weathered and lined like someone who had spent a lifetime outdoors. But the eyes were wrong. They reflected light like an animal's, creating bright spots in the darkness that seemed to glow with their own internal illumination. "Folks," the ranger called across the parking lot, his voice carrying the friendly authority of someone accustomed to dealing with lost hikers. "I'm Ranger Patterson. Got a report you might need some assistance getting home." Derek's throat felt too tight to speak, but Amanda found her voice. "We're fine," she called back, though her words trembled with barely controlled terror. "Just having some car trouble." Ranger Patterson approached them with the measured pace of someone who had all the time in the world. Up close, Derek could see that the uniform's patches were wrong. They showed the National Park Service Arrowhead logo, but Mount Thornfield wasn't a national park. The name tag read Patterson in letters that seemed to shift slightly when Derek wasn't looking directly at them. "Car trouble's common up here," the ranger said, conversationally stopping just outside the range of their flashlight beams. "Something about the mountain interferes with modern electronics, but don't worry, we'll get you folks taken care of." He gestured toward his sedan with a movement that managed to be both welcoming and threatening. "Why don't you ride with me back to town? We can send a tow truck for your vehicle in the morning." Derek's every instinct screamed against accepting the offer, but their alternative was spending the night in a parking lot that felt increasingly like a trap. The Ford remained stubbornly dead despite multiple attempts to start it, and his cell phone now showed no signal despite having received the mysterious text message earlier. "Thank you," Amanda said, before Derek could object, "but we'll wait for someone to come looking for us. People know where we are." Ranger Patterson's smile widened, revealing teeth that caught the light like polished metal. "Oh, but that's just it," he said gently. "According to our records, nobody's been looking for you folks. According to our records, you've been missing for quite some time." He pulled a clipboard from his patrol car, consulting it by the light of a flashlight that seemed brighter than any standard model Derek had ever seen. "Derek Chen and Amanda Rodriguez," he read in the tone of someone checking items off a list. "Last seen October 5th. Search suspended after 2 weeks due to adverse weather conditions. Memorial service held November." Derek felt reality slip another notch, the solid ground of rational thought giving way beneath his feet like loose scree on a steep slope. "That's impossible," he managed. "Today is October 15. We just finished our hike." "Is it?" Ranger Patterson asked mildly, checking his own watch with theatrical precision. "According to my timepiece, today is October 29. You folks have been missing for 2 weeks. The whole town's been worried about you." He gestured toward the trail register Derek had examined moments earlier. "Why don't you check the logbook? See what date you signed in." Derek approached the register with leaden feet, though he already knew what he would find. Their entry now showed a date 2 weeks in the past. The ink faded as if it had been exposed to weather for exactly that amount of time. Below their names, dozens of additional entries chronicled a massive search effort. Ranger teams, volunteer groups, helicopter surveys, all searching for Derek Chen and Amanda Rodriguez, who had vanished without a trace on the Cascade Loop Trail. "What we remember," Amanda said desperately. "We remember every detail of today. The hike, the clearing, the stones." Ranger Patterson nodded sympathetically. "That's common with mountain disappearances." he explained in the patient tone of someone who had dealt with similar situations many times before. The mountain has a way of protecting folks from traumatic memories. 2 weeks lost in the wilderness can be quite an ordeal. He opened the sedan's rear door, the interior light revealing seats that looked comfortable despite the vehicle's apparent age. "Why don't you folks climb in? We'll get you down to the hospital, get you checked out, and then you can be reunited with your families. They've been worried sick." Derek backed away from the offered ride, pulling Amanda with him toward the trailhead where at least they would have escape routes into the forest if necessary. "We're not getting in that car," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Ranger Patterson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture that suggested infinite patience wearing thin. "Now, folks," he said, his tone remaining conversational despite an underlying steel that hadn't been there before. "I understand you've been through a lot, but I'm afraid I can't leave you up here. Mountain regulations, you understand." The sedan's engine continued its smooth idle, but Derek realized that he hadn't heard it approach. The vehicle had simply appeared at the parking lot's edge, with no warning sounds of an engine climbing the access road. Now that he was paying attention, he noticed other details that didn't fit. The headlights cast shadows that fell in impossible directions, and the chrome bumper reflected a star-filled sky despite the fact that clouds had covered most of the night. "Run," Derek whispered to Amanda, but before either could move, additional headlights appeared on the access road. Not one vehicle this time, but several, all moving with the same mechanical precision as Ranger Patterson's sedan. As the convoy approached, Derek counted 6 vehicles in total: Park Service trucks, Sheriff's Department cars, and what appeared to be an ambulance. All bore the wear and fading of equipment that had been in service for decades, but all moved with perfect mechanical efficiency despite their apparent age. The vehicles arranged themselves in a semicircle around the parking lot's perimeter, effectively blocking any escape route except the trail itself. Doors opened in unison, disgorging figures in various uniforms: rangers, deputies, paramedics, all carrying the same artificial authority as the man who claimed to be Patterson. Derek Chen and Amanda Rodriguez called a woman in a sheriff's uniform, consulting a clipboard identical to Patterson's. "You're under arrest for violation of wilderness camping regulations and failure to register your extended backcountry stay." Derek felt reality fracture completely as the uniformed figures advanced across the gravel with measured steps that seemed choreographed rather than natural. Their faces all shared the same wrong quality as Patterson's, human features animated by something that wasn't quite human intelligence. "This isn't real," Amanda said, backing toward the trail with Derek beside her. "None of this is real." But the gravel beneath their feet was solid. The cold air filled their lungs, and the advancing figures cast shadows in the harsh security lighting. Real or not, the consequences of remaining in place seemed clear enough. They turned and ran up the trail into darkness, leaving behind the parking lot filled with impossible vehicles and their uniformed occupants who made no attempt to pursue. Behind them, Derek heard the sound of car doors slamming in unison, followed by engines starting in perfect synchronization. As they climbed the familiar switchbacks by headlamp light, Derek realized that running deeper into the mountain was exactly what the figures in the parking lot wanted them to do. They were being herded back toward the stone circle, back toward the memorial tree with its spiral of carved names, back toward whatever waited in the hidden clearings where missing hikers became statistics on impossible flyers. At the first trail junction, Derek grabbed Amanda's hand and pulled her off the main path onto a steep slope that dropped toward the valley floor through dense timber. They crashed through undergrowth and over deadfall logs, sacrificing stealth for speed as they tried to reach lower elevations where the normal world might still exist. But after 20 minutes of desperate descent, they emerged onto a familiar trail, the very same Cascade loop they had tried to escape. The mountain had folded space around them, leading them in a circle despite their best efforts to break free of its influence. Behind them on the trail, flashlight beams began to appear through the trees. The flashlight beams behind them moved with methodical precision through the darkness, sweeping back and forth across the trail in patterns too regular to be human. Derek counted at least 8 separate lights advancing in a line formation that suggested military training rather than the random search pattern of rescue workers. The beams never wavered, never paused to examine interesting terrain features, and never lost the trail despite the difficult conditions. Amanda pulled Derek off the path again, this time toward a steep ravine that dropped away into impenetrable blackness. They slid down loose scree and crashed through Devil's Club thickets, the thorny stalks tearing at their clothing, as they descended toward what they hoped might be a creek drainage that could lead them out of the mountain's influence. "Listen," Amanda gasped during a brief rest behind a massive boulder. "The sounds are wrong." Derek strained his ears against the mountain's silence, trying to identify what Amanda had noticed. The pursuing flashlights continued their methodical advance above them, but the beams cast no accompanying sounds of footsteps on gravel, breaking branches, or heavy breathing. The lights moved through the forest in perfect silence, as if carried by something that had no need for physical contact with the ground. More unsettling still was the absence of natural night sounds. No owls called from the darkness, no small mammals rustled through the undergrowth, no insects chirped from hidden locations. The mountain had become a dead zone, where only the mechanical thrumming persisted, now so omnipresent that Derek had begun to think of it as the sound of the mountain's breathing. They resumed their descent, following what appeared to be a game trail that switched back down the ravine's steep walls. Derek's headlamp illuminated twisted trees that seemed to reach toward them with branch configurations that suggested grasping fingers. Behind them, the pursuing lights had spread out in a wider search pattern, but none had followed them into the ravine, a fact that should have been reassuring but instead increased Derek's sense of dread. "They're herding us," he realized, pausing at a sharp turn in the trail. "They're not trying to catch us. They're making sure we go exactly where they want us to go." Amanda checked her compass, though the needle spun wildly without settling on any consistent direction. "Down," she said with grim determination. "Whatever's happening up there, down has to be better." But as they continued their descent, the terrain began to change in ways that violated basic geology. The rock formations grew more angular and regular, as if natural stone were being reshaped by some massive force operating beneath the surface. Tree growth became sparse and stunted, with branches that formed geometric patterns too precise to be random mutations. At what Derek estimated was 2,000 feet below their starting point, impossible, given the ravine's apparent depth from above, they emerged into a valley that shouldn't have existed. The space was vast and perfectly circular, perhaps 2 miles across, enclosed by walls of living rock that rose into darkness beyond their headlamp range. At the valley's center, a structure waited that made Derek's mind recoil from its implications. It was a building, but no human architect had designed its alien geometries. The structure rose in terraces and spirals that hurt to look at directly, constructed from the same black granite as the memorial stones, but on a scale that dwarfed any earthly architecture. Windows glowed with soft light that cast no illumination on the surrounding ground, and doorways opened onto interiors that seemed to extend far deeper than the building's external dimensions could accommodate. "My God," Amanda whispered, raising her camera with movements made automatic by professional instinct. "What is that thing?" But when she looked through the viewfinder, the LCD screen showed only empty valley floor. The camera's sensors could not process whatever waited at the clearing's heart, leaving her with electronic snow where the impossible structure should have been recorded. The mechanical thrumming was louder here, emanating from the building itself in waves that Derek could feel in his bones. The sound had evolved beyond mere machinery into something that resembled music, complex harmonies that seemed to speak directly to the nervous system without passing through the ears. Derek found his pulse synchronizing with the rhythm again, but this time the effect felt less threatening and more welcoming. "Derek," Amanda said urgently, grabbing his arm as he took an involuntary step toward the structure. Don't listen to it. Whatever that sound is doing, fight it. He shook his head to clear the growing fog that had been settling over his thoughts. The building's music was seductive, promising rest and belonging to travelers who had wandered far from home. But Amanda's touch anchored him to his own identity, reminding him of purposes and connections that existed outside the mountain's influence. They circled the valley's perimeter, staying as far as possible from the central structure, while searching for an exit route. But the rock walls proved to be exactly that, solid stone rising beyond the reach of their lights without any visible breaks or passages. They were trapped in a geological impossibility, a circular valley that had no connection to the outside world. As they completed their circuit, Derek noticed movement near the alien building. Figures were emerging from doorways and flowing down the terraced walls, like water finding its natural level. At first, he thought they were more uniformed officials like the ones who had pursued them from the parking lot. But as the figures drew closer, Derek realized these were the missing hikers themselves. Marcus Webb approached them first, his face bearing the peaceful expression of someone who had found exactly what he was looking for. The young man looked exactly as he had in the missing person photos Derek had seen in Seattle newspapers, unchanged despite supposedly vanishing 4 days earlier. "Derek, Amanda," Marcus said warmly, as if greeting old friends at a reunion. "We've been waiting for you. Everyone's here." Behind Marcus came others, dozens of figures emerging from the building's impossible interior. Derek recognized some faces from the memorial stones: Robert and Catherine Mills, walking hand in hand with the serene expressions of longtime lovers; Jennifer and Michael Park, looking no older than they had in 1996; Margaret and James Fletcher, their clothing styles marking them as products of the 1960s, but their faces showing no signs of aging. "This isn't real," Amanda said, though her voice lacked conviction. The figures approaching them were undeniably solid, casting shadows in their headlamp beams and leaving footprints in the valley's soft earth. "Reality is more flexible than most people understand," said a new voice, and Derek turned to see a woman in hiking gear that looked decades out of date. She appeared to be in her 30s, with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to mountain terrain. "I'm Patricia Nolan. I've been waiting to meet you since." Derek's mind struggled to process the impossibility of a woman who had been missing for 25 years, appearing exactly as she had at the time of her disappearance. Patricia showed no signs of aging, no effects of a quarter century in the wilderness. She looked as if she had stepped out of a 1970s hiking magazine advertisement. "How?" was all Derek managed to ask. Patricia smiled with genuine warmth. "The mountain provides," she said simply. "It offers something that the outside world never could: permanence, community, purpose." She gestured toward the building at the valley's heart, and Derek realized that what he had taken for alien architecture was actually organic in nature. The structure was alive, growing from the valley floor like some impossible fusion of plant and mineral. Its walls pulsed with the same rhythm as the mechanical thrumming, and its windows glowed with bioluminescent light. "What do you want from us?" Amanda asked, though Derek could hear that her resistance was weakening. The figures surrounding them radiated contentment and belonging, emotions that had been rare in their high-stress Seattle lives. "Nothing," said Catherine Mills, stepping forward with her husband Robert. "The mountain doesn't take, it offers. A chance to be part of something larger than individual existence. A community that transcends the ordinary limitations of human life." Derek felt the building's music working on his consciousness again, breaking down the barriers between self and other, individual and collective. The missing hikers weren't prisoners, they were colonists, pioneers who had discovered a new form of existence that lay beyond traditional concepts of life and death. "Look around you," Robert Mills continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades contemplating the mountain's mysteries. "No aging, no disease, no loneliness. We have become part of the mountain's consciousness, and it has become part of ours." Amanda was recording everything despite her camera's inability to capture the central building. Her journalist instincts demanded documentation, even as her rational mind struggled to accept what her senses reported. "And if we refuse?" she asked. "Refusal isn't possible," Patricia Nolan said gently. "Not because we would force you, but because once you understand what's being offered, no one chooses to leave." Derek looked back toward the valley's walls, noting that the rock formations now pulsed with the same bioluminescent glow as the building's windows. The entire valley was alive, a massive organism that had been growing beneath Mount Thornfield for centuries. The missing hikers hadn't been killed or kidnapped. They had been absorbed into something larger than human civilization had ever imagined. The memorial stones, Derek realized, they're not marking deaths, they're marking transformations. Marcus Webb nodded approvingly. Each stone represents someone who chose to become part of the mountain's greater consciousness. We maintain our individual memories and personalities, but we also share in the collective experience of everyone who has joined us. As if to demonstrate, Marcus's eyes briefly glowed with the same bioluminescent light as the building's windows. For a moment, Derek could see other personalities looking out through Marcus's features, faces and expressions that belonged to the dozens of people who had vanished on Mount Thornfield over the decades. "The outside world is dying," Catherine Mills said sadly. "Wars, pollution, the gradual destruction of everything wild and beautiful. Here we can preserve what matters most. We can become caretakers of the wilderness instead of its destroyers." Derek felt Amanda's hand slip into his, their fingers intertwining as they faced the most important decision of their lives. The mountain's offer was seductive: eternal youth, perfect community, freedom from the anxieties and limitations of modern existence. But it came at the cost of everything they had been building together in the ordinary world. "Your families," Amanda said suddenly. "What about the people who love you, who are mourning your disappearances?" A shadow passed across Patricia Nolan's features, the first sign of anything less than perfect contentment Derek had seen among the mountain's community. "That is, the one sadness," she admitted. "The mountain's reach extends only to these valleys. We cannot return to ease their pain." Derek thought of his parents in Portland, of the life he and Amanda had been building in Seattle, of the engagement ring that still waited in his backpack. The normal world held imperfections and struggles, but it also contained possibilities for growth and change that seemed absent from the mountain's perfect stasis. "We need time to think," Derek said, though even as he spoke, he realized that time might not operate normally in this place. "Of course," Robert Mills said kindly. "The mountain is patient. It has been growing for millennia, and it can wait a few hours more." The assembled figures began to withdraw toward the living building, moving with the synchronized grace of a single organism. But before they disappeared entirely, Marcus Webb turned back with one final message. "The choice isn't whether to join us," he said softly. "The choice is whether to accept it willingly or resist until the mountain completes the process naturally. Either way, you're already part of us. You have been since you first heard the mountain's song." Derek felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. The mechanical thrumming that had been following them all day wasn't just the mountain's heartbeat. It was a form of infection, a psychic virus that gradually synchronized human consciousness with the alien intelligence that lay beneath Mount Thornfield. As the last of the missing hikers disappeared into the building, Derek and Amanda found themselves alone in the impossible valley. But the solitude was an illusion. Derek could feel other minds pressing against his consciousness, offering friendship and belonging, and relief from the terrible isolation of individual existence. "We have to fight it," Amanda said, but her voice carried exhaustion and growing doubt. "There has to be a way out." Derek nodded, though he was no longer certain what out might mean. If Marcus was correct, they were already infected by the mountain's influence. Their very presence in this place might have doomed them to eventual absorption regardless of their conscious choices. He pulled out his GPS unit, hoping against hope for some indication that normal physical laws still applied. but the screen showed only error messages and impossible coordinates that placed them simultaneously in multiple locations across the Pacific Northwest. Even the laws of space had broken down in the mountain's heart. "The engagement ring," Amanda said suddenly. "Show me the engagement ring." Derek stared at her in confusion. Of all the things to worry about in their current situation, his planned proposal seemed remarkably irrelevant. But Amanda's expression carried desperate intensity that suggested something more than romantic curiosity. "Show me," she insisted. "If we're still ourselves, if we still have individual will, then show me the future you wanted us to have." Derek retrieved the small blue velvet box from his pack, opening it to reveal the diamond ring that now seemed like an artifact from another civilization. The stone caught their headlamp beams, throwing tiny rainbows across Amanda's face as she examined the symbol of their commitment to an ordinary human future. "Ask me," she said quietly. "Right here, right now. Before we lose the chance forever." Derek knelt on the soft earth of the impossible valley, surrounded by the emanations of an alien intelligence that offered transcendence at the cost of humanity. "Amanda Rodriguez," he said, his voice steady despite their circumstances. "Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, slipping the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled with emotion rather than fear. "Yes to you, yes to our life together, yes to growing old and making mistakes and being gloriously, imperfectly human." The ring seemed to anchor them to their individual identities, creating a bubble of purely human connection that the mountain's influence couldn't penetrate. For the first time since entering the valley, Derek felt completely like himself, not a potential component of a larger consciousness, but Derek Chen, software engineer from Seattle, in love with Amanda Rodriguez, and committed to building a life with her in the ordinary world. The mountain's response was immediate and overwhelming. The thrumming grew so loud that Derek felt his eardrums might burst, and the bioluminescent glow from the building flared into painful brilliance. The assembled community of missing hikers poured from the structure's doorways, their faces no longer peaceful but desperate with need. "You're making a mistake," Patricia Nolan called across the valley. "Individual consciousness is an evolutionary dead end. We're offering you the chance to become something greater." But Derek and Amanda were already moving, climbing toward the valley's rim with renewed purpose. The ring on Amanda's finger seemed to pulse with its own light, creating a path through the bioluminescent confusion that the mountain had cast around them. They climbed through stone that tried to reform itself beneath their feet, past trees that reached out with branch fingers to drag them back toward the valley floor. Behind them, the building's music shifted into a minor key that spoke of loss and profound disappointment. The mountain had been patient for decades, collecting isolated individuals who could be absorbed without significant resistance. But Derek and Amanda's commitment to each other created a form of resistance that the alien intelligence had not encountered before. They reached the valley's rim as dawn light began to filter through the forest canopy above. But this was not the alien landscape they had descended through the night before. They found themselves on a familiar ridge, looking down at the parking lot where their Ford Explorer waited exactly where they had left it 12 hours earlier. Derek checked his watch, blinking in surprise at the display. 6:45 a.m., October 16, 1998. They had experienced an entire night of supernatural encounters, but only a few hours had passed in normal time. The mountain's distortion of time and space was breaking down, reality reasserting itself as they climbed away from its influence. They descended to the parking lot at a run, desperate to escape, before the mountain could reassert its hold on them. The Explorer's engine turned over immediately, as if it had never experienced any mechanical problems. Derek's cell phone showed full signal strength and a handful of missed calls from friends who had expected to hear about their hiking adventure. As they drove down the access road, Derek caught glimpses of the memorial stones in his rearview mirror. But now the stones appeared weathered and cracked, their silver inlay tarnished with age. The perfect preservation he had observed during their supernatural journey was fading, revealing decades of exposure to mountain weather. "Did it really happen?" Amanda asked, examining the photographs on her camera. The LCD screen showed normal hiking pictures, scenic views, wildlife shots, and several images of Derek looking nervous near a standard forest overlook. But there was one anomaly, a single frame that showed Amanda's left hand wearing the engagement ring, though Derek was certain she hadn't put it on until they were trapped in the impossible valley. Derek consulted his GPS, checking the track log that should have recorded their entire journey. According to the electronic record, they had hiked the standard Cascade loop trail, reached Overlook Point for lunch, and returned to the parking lot by early evening. No detours, no off-trail exploration, no mysterious valleys that violated the laws of physics. But as they reached the highway that would take them back to Seattle, Derek noticed something that confirmed their experience had been more than collective hallucination. The missing persons flyer that had been tucked under their windshield the night before was still there, folded and tucked into Amanda's jacket pocket. The paper was real, complete with their photographs and a memorial service date that was still 2 weeks in the future. But now the flyer showed signs of age and weather exposure that suggested it had been printed years rather than hours ago. At the bottom, in small print that Derek hadn't noticed before, was a single line that made his blood run cold. Distributed by the Mount Thornfield Memorial Foundation, established. Someone's been watching the mountain for decades, Amanda realized, studying the flyer with her journalist's eye for significant details. This isn't a recent phenomenon. It's been going on for generations. Derek thought of the memorial stones with their decades of carved names, the missing hikers who had vanished without leaving any trace in official records. Mount Thornfield's appetite for human consciousness was apparently well known to certain individuals, even if the general public remained unaware of the danger. As they drove through Cedar Falls, Derek noticed details that had escaped his attention during their morning passage through town. Several businesses displayed small memorial plaques bearing names and dates, always single individuals or couples, always with dates spanning back to the early 90s. The local newspaper office had a display case filled with missing persons stories that stretched back decades, all involving hikers who had vanished in the Mount Thornfield wilderness. The town knew. The entire community was complicit in a conspiracy of silence that allowed the mountain to continue its harvest of human consciousness. They provided the infrastructure that brought hikers to the area, then memorialized their disappearances with the resigned acceptance of people who understood they lived in proximity to something beyond human comprehension. Amanda was documenting everything with her camera, building a record that might eventually expose the truth about Mount Thornfield. But Derek wondered whether anyone would believe their story, or whether the mountain's influence extended far enough to suppress any attempts at revelation. As they reached the outskirts of town, Derek's cell phone rang. The caller ID showed unknown number, but when he answered, he recognized the voice immediately. "Derek," said Ranger Patterson, though his tone was now entirely different from the threatening authority he had displayed the night before. "I wanted to congratulate you both on your escape. It's been quite some time since anyone has managed to resist the mountain's invitation." Derek pulled over to the side of the highway, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. "Who are you?" he asked. "What do you really want?" "I'm exactly who I claim to be," Patterson replied. "A park ranger who has been monitoring Mount Thornfield for longer than you might expect. The difference is that I serve as a guardian rather than a shepherd. I try to warn people away from the mountain's influence when possible." "Then why didn't you help us last night?" Patterson's laugh carried decades of weariness. "Because help wasn't possible once you had heard the mountain's song. The only way to escape was to find something stronger than individual will. Love, as it turns out, creates its own form of resistance that the mountain cannot easily overcome." Derek looked at Amanda, still wearing the engagement ring that had somehow anchored them to their human identities during the mountain's attempt at absorption. "Are we safe now?" "For the moment," Patterson said carefully. "But the mountain is patient, and its influence extends farther than most people realize. You'll need to be careful about returning to this area. The invitation remains open, and it becomes more compelling with each exposure. The line went dead, leaving Derek and Amanda alone with the weight of their impossible experience. They drove back to Seattle in thoughtful silence, each lost in contemplation of what they had encountered and what it meant for their future together. 3 weeks later, Derek opened the Seattle Times to find a small article buried on page 6. Local hiking couple found after 2 weeks search. The story reported that Marcus Webb and Jennifer Hayes had been discovered in good health after disappearing on Mount Thornfield, claiming to have no memory of their time in the wilderness. They were described as confused but physically unharmed, with no explanation for their extended absence. Derek showed the article to Amanda over breakfast in their new apartment, noting the subtle differences between this account and their own experience. Marcus and Jennifer had apparently chosen differently, accepting the mountain's offer before being returned to normal reality with carefully edited memories. "Do you think they're still themselves?" Amanda asked, studying the accompanying photograph that showed 2 young people with slightly vacant expressions. Derek wasn't sure. The Marcus Webb he had encountered in the Impossible Valley had retained his individual personality while gaining access to the collective consciousness of the mountain's community. If that version had been real, then the Marcus Webb now living in Seattle might be something else entirely, a human shell carrying a fragment of the mountain's alien intelligence. Amanda was working on a story about missing hikers in the Pacific Northwest, using careful research and anonymous sources to build a case that something unusual was happening in certain wilderness areas. But every attempt to publish her findings met with editorial resistance and legal challenges from organizations that seemed to have unlimited resources for suppressing unwelcome publicity. Derek found himself checking missing persons reports obsessively, noting patterns that suggested Mount Thornfield wasn't unique. Across the country, certain wilderness areas showed statistical anomalies in hiker disappearances, rates that were far too high to be explained by natural hazards or human error. Sometimes, late at night when sleep proved elusive, Derek could still hear the mountain's song calling from the darkness. The mechanical thrumming that had synchronized with his heartbeat, the voices of the missing hikers offering community and transcendence. Amanda would find him standing at their apartment window, staring toward the Cascade Mountains that rose like dark teeth against the eastern sky. "Do you regret it?" she asked one night, joining him at the window with 2 cups of coffee. Not accepting what they offered? Derek considered the question seriously. Their life in Seattle was good, but not perfect. Work stress, financial pressures, the ordinary struggles of building a relationship in the modern world. The mountain had offered escape from all of that, plus immortality and perfect community with dozens of interesting people from across the decades. But as he looked at Amanda's face in the window's reflection, Derek knew he had made the right choice. The mountain's community was perfect because it was static, unchanging, protected from the messy complexity of real growth and development. Their human life offered something that transcendence couldn't match, the possibility of becoming more than they currently were, together. "No regrets," he said, taking her hand and feeling the engagement ring's familiar weight on her finger. "We chose to remain gloriously, imperfectly human." Amanda smiled, but Derek could see the same haunted quality in her eyes that he felt in his own soul. They had escaped Mount Thornfield's influence, but they would never entirely escape the knowledge of what waited in the hidden valleys beneath the ancient peaks. Somewhere in the darkness, the mountain continued its patient harvest, adding new names to its spiral of memorial stones, while offering transcendence to travelers who had lost their way in more than just geographical terms. The mechanical thrumming continued its eternal rhythm, calling to those who were ready to abandon individual consciousness for something larger and more permanent. Derek and Amanda had chosen differently, but the invitation remained open, growing more compelling with each passing year. In the end, Mount Thornfield's greatest strength was also its greatest weakness. It could only take what was offered freely, and as long as people found reasons to remain human, love, hope, stubborn determination to grow and change and make mistakes, the mountain's perfect community would remain incomplete. Derek squeezed Amanda's hand, drawing strength from their connection, as the Cascade Mountains loomed against the star-filled sky. Somewhere in those peaks, dozens of missing hikers had found the transcendence they sought, but Derek and Amanda had found something even rarer, the courage to remain imperfect, mortal and gloriously human in a world that offered increasingly seductive alternatives. The mountain would wait. It had time. But so did they.